You won't believe what this cowboy did. In the dead of winter, 1995, when everything was frozen and the world had seemingly forgotten a certain isolated ranch in Wyoming, he showed up, carrying a bottle of milk wrapped in thick cloth, sack of fresh bread, and a look in his eyes that spoke louder than 1,000 words. But what he found behind that cracked door would change everyone's lives forever. A worn-out woman, 2 starving little girls, and a silence that screamed for help. What started as a simple gesture, an unassuming visit, became the beginning of a story that will warm your heart and challenge everything you believe about love, new beginnings, and redemption. Stay with me until the end of this video, because this isn't just a story about a man who brought groceries during a storm. It's about someone who silently carried the promise of a new home in his hands. A story of rebuilding, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, gaze by gaze. Every visit chipped away at the ice left behind by sorrow. Every word, every shared silence, built something stronger than any barn would: trust. And when he gently touched the first strand of her hair, it wasn't just a gesture, it was a silent plea to stay. Get ready, because what's about to unfold between Luke and Emily isn't just moving, it's transformational, and you'll understand why. It was the winter of 1995, and Hollow Creek was plunged into a deep, white silence. The kind of silence that only the wind dared to disturb, whistling through the fences and tapping against the windows as if carrying forgotten messages. The narrow dirt road was covered in snow and ice, and Luke Harris's old blue Ford F-150 pickup truck crept along, its tires squealing under the weight of the cold. Before I continue, subscribe to the channel right now, so you'll always receive moving and inspiring stories like this one. And tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love hearing where our stories reach. Luke continued with a watchful eye, observing every detail around him. It was a normal day of delivering feed and caring for his horses, until something broke the routine. High above, in the most secluded spot in the valley, he saw a thin column of smoke rising lazily, almost timidly, from an ancient chimney. The ranch, half hidden behind a grove of pine trees, seemed forgotten by the world. Luke narrowed his eyes. This was the Sanders house, or at least it had been. No one had been there in months. Some said it had been abandoned after Emily's husband left early last winter. Others whispered that she had left too. But now, there was smoke. He slowed down and parked on the narrow shoulder. The cold seeped through the crack in the window like a thin blade. Luke stood there for a few seconds, just watching, as if trying to guess the story behind that wisp of smoke. So he decided to go up. The pickup truck bounced over the uneven road, the tire chains slapping against the ice. When it stopped in front of the house, Luke noticed the worn boards on the porch, the peeling paint, and a side window covered by a feed sack nailed shut with rusty nails. He climbed down, the weight of his boots sinking into the soft snow, and grabbed a bag of fresh bread and a bottle of milk wrapped in a thick cloth to keep it from freezing. He climbed the steps slowly and knocked on the door with the back of his hand. Just once, the sound echoed in the house. Silence. Then a crack opened. A childlike face appeared. Brown hair tangled, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes watchful and suspicious. "Hi," Luke said calmly, lowering his voice slightly so as not to startle anyone. "I brought you some bread and milk." The girl looked back, then back at him, and opened the door a little wider. The smell of smoke wafted along with the chilly air. Across the way, on a blanket on the floor, a second, younger girl watched curiously, her face half hidden. And that's when he saw her. Emily Sanders knelt by the fireplace, stirring the embers with a piece of iron. She wore a worn dress, a faded apron over it, and her hair was hastily tied back, a few loose strands falling over her face. When she looked up, her eyes held something hard to describe, a mixture of strength and exhaustion. Luke felt the air shift inside him. "I saw the smoke. I thought I'd better go and check it out." he said, holding out the bread and milk. Emily stood up slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked over to him. "Thank you," she replied, almost automatically but politely. The girls remained silent, one hugging the bread as if it were a gift. Luke looked around. Damp-stained walls, a single chair, a cracked plate drying on a cloth. The house had been built to last, but now it seemed to be struggling to survive along with its inhabitants. "Are you guys okay here?" he asked. Emily shrugged. "We'll manage." The stove gave off a faint heat, and Luke knew from the smell alone that the wood was running low. "I can bring more tomorrow." "I have plenty." She looked at him for a moment, assessing. "Okay." Luke nodded and left. As he descended the steps, he felt it wasn't just the winter cold that made him look back. There was something about that woman, something in her eyes, that seemed to be asking for help without a word. He got into his truck, turned on the AM radio, but ignored the country music playing. Her face was still on his mind. Emily hadn't asked for anything, but she hadn't closed the door either. And for Luke Harris, that was reason enough to come back. On the way back, the snow began to fall in thick flakes, quickly erasing his tire tracks. And as the world outside grew white and silent again, he wondered, why do I feel like this place will change everything? The next day dawned with a lighter wind, but the cold remained biting. Frost still coated the fences like brittle glass, and the sky, though clear, carried that pale winter light that seemed to warm nothing. Luke woke early, lit the wood stove in his kitchen, and made strong coffee. As he took his first sip, his thoughts returned to Emily's house. The image of her by the fireplace, the girls cuddling over bread, wouldn't leave his mind. Wasting no time, he placed fresh eggs in a wooden crate, wrapped a piece of cheese in waxed paper, and separated a few bundles of dry firewood. He loaded everything into the back of the F-150, arranging it so it wouldn't fall over on the narrow curves in the road. He turned on the AM radio. The announcer was talking about a possible cold front that would return in a few days, and even with the news, Luke felt a strange rush to get there before any storms hit. When the pickup truck pulled up in front of the ranch, Clara, the oldest, was peering out the window, but quickly backed away when she realized he'd seen her. Megan, the youngest, appeared at the door seconds later with a toothless smile and disheveled hair. "Did you bring bread today?" she asked, her voice anxious. Luke crouched down to her level, pretending to rummage through the box. "No, but I brought something better. Fresh eggs and cheese?" Megan grinned and ran inside with the news. Emily emerged soon after, her wool coat buttoned up to her neck. There were no smiles, but neither was there the same barrier in her eyes. "You can leave it on the kitchen table," she said, opening the door wider. Luke stepped inside, leaving the cold outside behind. The warmth of the fireplace was more present, but still faint, and the smell of smoke mixed with weak coffee filled the air. He didn't ask personal questions. He commented on the weather, the price of coarse salt in town, and even about a stubborn horse that had nearly thrown him that day. Emily listened as she placed the eggs on a shelf and arranged the wood next to the stove. Luke could tell she wasn't in a hurry to end the visit, but she also didn't allow herself to be drawn into long conversations. Throughout the week, Luke returned every day. Sometimes he brought flour, other times a piece of salted meat. And he always brought firewood, more than they could burn in a single day. The girls began to wait for him. Clara tried to hide it, but Megan greeted him at the door, asking what the day's surprise was. He laughed, pretending to be keeping a big secret, and handed them a wrapped candy or a quick story about life in the pasture. Emily maintained the distance of someone protecting something precious. But Luke could recognize small signs. The less dry tone of her voice, the fact that she no longer crossed her arms when he spoke. the look that lingered for a second longer when he said goodbye. One afternoon, as he was leaving a bundle of firewood leaning against the porch, Luke felt her watching him. He turned and saw her on the porch, her loose hair dancing in the wind. Her eyes followed him with an expression difficult to decipher. He lifted his hat in a gesture of farewell. Emily held his gaze, and as he walked away toward the pickup, she whispered something too low for him to hear. "I don't know why you keep coming." The wind carried the words away, but inside her something was already beginning to change. The late afternoon light lay over Hollow Creek like a warm blanket as Luke parked the F-150 near the porch and turned off the AM radio, which whispered an old Alan Jackson ballad. The cold still bit his skin, but the wind had died down, and for the first time in weeks, there was the smell of bread baking and the sweet wood smoke. Emily wore a thick coat, hands in her pockets, watching her daughters with the attentiveness of someone counting heartbeats. He gently lifted the box of groceries flour, some coffee, some nails, and attempted a brief smile, as if he didn't want to scare a deer. "Can you come in?" he asked without pressure. She gave a simple nod and made room, and the house, once a fortress, gave way a crack. The air inside felt less heavy, and Luke understood. Today, perhaps, she wanted to talk. The kitchen was as clean as possible, organized by priorities. On the enameled table, bread rose under a cloth, and the kettle hissed at the right times. Emily poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and stood for a moment, gauging the distance, until she sat across from him. They started with the safe stuff: the weather, the gray days that insisted on returning, the cordless phone forecast she heard at her neighbor's house on Saturdays. Then horses. Luke described the stubborn chestnut that would only accept a saddle, when he hummed the same refrain, and the young filly who had a habit of chewing on the stall's bridle. Gradually, Emily's voice took on color. She remembered the pasture in the spring of 1989, the races her father had arranged, the golden dust rising at sunset. When he laughed, it was a brief burst of summer in a winter-home dot. As she spoke, Luke noticed the details that don't ask permission to tell stories. Fine cracks on her knuckles, reddened skin where the axe hugged the palm, a makeshift bandage on her index finger. When Emily tugged at the hem of her pants to adjust her boot, he saw the map of calluses on the top of her foot and thought of the cold ground, the heavy wood, the icy water from the well. He swallowed hard. "I can check the north pasture fence tomorrow. I saw the last snowstorm knock down the first post." She paused for a second, then sipped her coffee, as if searching deep within the bitterness for an answer that wouldn't hurt. "I don't want to give you any more trouble." He set the mug down, serious and simple. "It's not trouble if it's necessary." The silence that followed wasn't a wall. It was a bridge beginning. Clara appeared in the doorway, her coat open and her nose red. "Mommy, the stove's flame is low." Emily jumped up, and Luke followed her, examining the register, blowing on the embers, and adjusting the wood-burning stove lid. "Get these kindling, Megan," he said, and the younger girl ran in thick socks, proudly carrying the small bundle, like someone wearing a crown. The fire responded with a lively crackle, and the scent of hot dough filled the kitchen. "It's not magic, it's air," Luke explained, pointing to the vents. "Fire needs to breathe, just like people," Megan laughed. Clara stored the information with the care of someone who collects tools. Emily looked over her shoulder, her expression somewhere between surprise and relief, as if a forgotten gear had started turning again. When the dough was in the oven, they stood on the porch watching the sun fall. A neighbor's old Ford Ranger passed slowly on the dirt road, its engine disappearing into the valley. "This ranch was noisy," Emily said, staring into space. "Good noise. Wagon wheels, laughter, the radio blaring during the harvest. Then there was only the wind." Luke kept his hands in his pockets, choosing his words like someone choosing a good plank. Silence is also a raw material. We build solid things with it. She turned her head slightly, surprised by the image. I don't always know what to build with what's left. He measured the horizon. A fence holds up with three things: a post, wire, and compacted earth. People hold up with three things too: truth, warm bread, and someone to say, "I'll be back tomorrow." Returned inside as the bread began to perfume the entire room. Emily removed the pan from the oven with a folded cloth, steam rising in a white cloud, and the girls, mesmerized, waited for the first slice as if expecting a miracle. Luke cut it with a dull knife, divided it into four, and spread it with a dab of butter he'd brought wrapped. No one spoke for a minute, and the sound of the clock on the wall became a trail. "Do you always speak softly to horses?" Clara asked, breaking the spell. "Always," he said. "A wild animal only learns calmly." Emily shrugged, a barely visible smile. "People too." Luke's gaze touched hers and rested. The bread disappeared quickly. The cold for a few minutes too. Before he left a roll of barbed wire, nails, 2 new hinges, and a bundle of string on the table. "For the fence tomorrow, and for the drawer that sticks." Emily touched the hinge as if it were a jewel. Luke pretended not to see. He grabbed his coat, adjusted his hat, and lingered a second longer at the door, as if searching for a goodbye that wouldn't startle. "I'll be by soon." She didn't promise coffee, nor did she smile broadly. She nodded, but her eyes said, "Come back." The daughters ran to the doorway, blocking the wind with joy. Megan waved exaggeratedly. Clara bit her lip to hold back. A question she didn't dare ask. Outside, the night breathed deeply. On the porch, the cold crept in again. Luke descended the steps, the frozen gravel crunching beneath his boots. The sky, a deep blue flecked with ice, reflected off the hood of the F-150. He turned the key, and the engine responded with that ancient growl that seems to be part of the landscape. Before entering, he glanced over his shoulder. Emily stood. In the doorway, arms crossed, her hair tied back, 2 stubborn strands escaping. He wanted to say something, anything that would amount to a promise, but he didn't spoil the delicate fabric they had. He simply touched his hat with 2 fingers and smiled the way he knew. She understood Dot as the truck began to descend the driveway. Clara and Megan stood shoulder to shoulder, as they did when they wanted to share a secret. "He seems different from other men," Megan whispered, twisting her hat between her fingers. Clara took a moment to answer, like someone driving a nail until the wood accepts it. "Yes," she finally said, almost in a whisper. "He's different." Inside the house, the bread still spread warmth, the wood crackled with life, and Emily leaned her forehead against the wood of the door for a moment, listening to the sound of the engine fading away. There are silences that close, and there are silences that open. Hers, in that moment, opened Dot in the valley. The echo of the engine faded, and the wind gently regained its footing. Luke drove in low gear, feeling the weight in his chest, as if he had placed a post firmly in its proper place. Tomorrow there would be a fence wire, perhaps a radio tuned loudly to ward off the fatigue. Perhaps, who knows, longer laughs. He thought about the question he hadn't yet asked and what he needed to earn before asking it. In the distance, a dry bolt of lightning flashed, the kind that heralds change more than rain, and he smiled to himself. Some stories don't begin with a trumpet. They begin with warm bread, cut hands, and an "I'll be back tomorrow." And he would. Tomorrow, and the next day, until winter finally gave way. The day began heavily, with low clouds hiding the hilltops and a cold wind blowing from the north, carrying the metallic smell of a storm. Luke arrived early, his toolbox in the bed of his F-150, alongside some boards he'd cut the day before. Emily was outside, tying her apron around her waist when he parked. "The barn door creaks like an old car," she said, almost as an excuse for his presence. Luke smiled slightly, grabbed the ladder, and led the way. The barn, dark and damp, smelled of hay and wet wood. As he examined the structure, he noticed a messy corner, piled high with scraps of wood. He moved closer, crouched down, and touched the charred edges of a burnt drawer. They were furniture scraps. "Did you burn this?" she asked, not accusingly, but with the weight of someone who already knew the answer. Emily stood in the doorway, her body half turned, as if considering leaving. "Last year, in the worst cold, there wasn't enough firewood." Her voice held no shame, only knowledge. Luke looked at the remains of the chair and tabletop, imagining the nights she'd fed the fire with her own house to keep her daughters alive. "I shouldn't have to go through this." She shrugged, pulling the scarf tighter around her neck. "Life doesn't ask us what we should. It just comes, and we make do." Luke walked back to the pickup, opened the tailgate, and pulled out a thick, soft wool blanket, new, still smelling of the store. He also grabbed a small box of sharp tools, a sharpened axe, and woodworking oil. "From now on, you'll have plenty of firewood, and you won't have to burn anything that's part of this house." Emily glanced at the blanket, but didn't. "Offer her hand. You already bring food. You don't need this." He leaned closer, placing the blanket firmly in her arms. "I do. Because no one should have to choose between warmth and a home." The touch of his fingers brushed lightly against her hand as he released the fabric. Emily took a deep, almost imperceptible breath and looked at the blanket as if it held something more than wool, as if it were a piece of dignity restored. Luke walked away to return to his work, hammering on the barn door hinges, replacing rusty nails with new ones. The dry sound of the hammer echoed, breaking the thoughtful silence. She stood nearby, pretending to arrange some ropes, but in reality, she was watching him closely. Outside, the wind tugged at the newly lined door, but it held firm. Luke wiped his hands on the cloth and said, "Now the wind won't get in anymore." Emily clutched the blanket to her chest, her hands squeezing the fabric as if trying to memorize its texture. He gathered up his tools and walked to the truck. "I'll be back tomorrow to finish it." She didn't answer, just watched every step, every gesture. As EW is about to open the truck door, Emily spoke softly, almost to herself. "What do you really want, Luke Harris?" The wind carried the words before they reached his ears. Luke got in, slammed the door, and started the engine. She stood there, standing in the barn entrance, blanket in her arms, watching the tire tracks in the snow until she disappeared around the bend. In the kitchen, as she folded the blanket and draped it over the chair, Emily felt a different weight in the room. It wasn't the weight of the cold or the silence. It was something new, more unsettling. A kind of presence that lingered even when he wasn't there. She sat for a moment, her hands still clasped, and realized that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about what was missing, but about what she had just gained. Outside, Luke drove slowly down the icy road. The radio played softly, but his mind was elsewhere, on the way she clutched the blanket, on the firm but vulnerable tone with which she said, "No need." He knew that if he wanted to stay, he would have to be more than the man bringing supplies. He would have to be someone she would let in, not just through the door, but into the most protected space of her life. As the day drew to a close, a low mist rose from the valley, covering the fields like a blanket. Luke thought about future visits, perhaps bringing seeds for spring, perhaps tools to repair the side window. But more than that, he knew he was building something that couldn't be hammered together. It was something slower, more precise-like. Taming a wild horse requiring patience and constant presence. At the ranch, Emily pulled the blanket over her shoulders as she prepared dinner. The warmth of the fireplace touched her face, but it wasn't just the wood that warmed her. There was a new spark, hard to acknowledge, even harder to extinguish. Outside, night was falling, and the wind that had previously seemed to bring only cold now seemed to carry a promise. The snow was beginning to thin in the fields, and small patches of damp earth appeared, promising the arrival of spring. Luke parked the F-150 carefully, avoiding the soggy stretches of road. On the cab beside him rested a small arrangement of dried flowers tied with twine and a bag of seeds to plant once the soil warmed. Emily stood on the porch, bundled in a wool coat, and looked up when she saw him come up the steps. "I didn't know you were a florist too," she said, arching an eyebrow. Luke smirked, holding out the flowers. "I'm not, but I thought they'd look nice in your window. And the seeds, to bring color when winter leaves." Emily received the arrangement carefully, as if her touch might dismantle the fragile petals. She looked at the flowers for a moment, then back at him, as if trying to understand the meaning behind his gesture. "You don't have to bring those things, Luke." He placed the bag of seeds on the kitchen table, took off his hat, and turned it over in his hands. "I know, but I want to." She frowned slightly, not out of irritation, but because she wasn't sure where to place his insistence. The silence stretched until Luke exhaled slowly and spoke softly. "I lost my wife years ago, and for a while, I thought the house would swallow me. It was too big, and the silence was too heavy. I know what it's like to feel alone, even surrounded by walls." Emily lowered her gaze, turning the arrangement over in her hands. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "It's not pity that I want. It's just, I understand. And I don't come here just for the girls, or to fix something. I come because I want to be around, not just to help, but to build something." Emily clutched the flowers tighter, her fingers pressing against the string. What he was saying stirred places she'd kept closed off for years. She turned to the window, looking out at the nearly snow-free field. "I don't know if I know how to build something anymore." Luke stepped forward, but kept enough distance to avoid invading her space. "We'll learn again, together." The girls came running through the back door, bringing laughter and the cold smell of the outdoors. Megan held up a smooth pebble she'd found in the yard, and Clara carried a handful of twigs. The kitchen filled with their noise, and the moment dissolved, leaving a sweet but unresolved heaviness in the air. Luke put his hat back on and gave Emily a small wave. She walked him to the door, still holding the arrangement. Outside, the wind swayed the dry trees, and the crackling of the logs in the fireplace mingled with the rustling of the leaves. Neither of them said anything else. He descended the steps slowly, with each step feeling the weight of something that still had no answer. Emily stood on the porch, watching him cross the yard to his truck. The dried flower arrangement felt lighter now, almost a symbol of what? She couldn't yet say. As the engine roared and he began to pull away, she took a deep breath and realized that part of her wanted him to turn back before they even reached the end of the road. Inside the house, the warmth from the fireplace was constant but different. It didn't just come from the burning wood. It came from a new kind of presence that somehow lingered even after the door closed. Emily looked at the seeds on the table. Planting meant waiting, caring, believing something would sprout. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. But she also wasn't sure she wanted to avoid it. Outside, Luke drove down the narrow road, his hands tight on the steering wheel, thinking about what he'd said and what he hadn't. He knew he'd have to come back, not just to bring groceries or mend fences, but to prove, day after day, that he was willing to stay. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, tinting the sky with shades of copper and pink. At the ranch, Emily ran her fingers through the dried petals and, for the first time in a long time, considered the possibility of making room for something new. I didn't know what it would be, but like the seeds on the table, I felt it had already been planted. The sun was slowly sinking into the horizon as Luke turned the F-150 into the ranch's narrow driveway. It had been a long day, but the urge to stop by before heading home overwhelmed his fatigue. He'd barely turned off the engine when Emily appeared on the porch, her hair tied back in a loose bun, the smell of cooking wafting through the open door. "Stay for dinner," she said, as if saying something simple, but carrying more meaning than "it appears." Luke stood there for a second, almost surprised, before responding with a nod and a tight smile. The kitchen was warm from the wood-burning stove, and the aroma of stew wafted through the air. The simple table was set with enameled plates and cutlery slightly bent from use. The girls were already seated, Megan swinging her short legs under her chair, and Clara arranging the bread in the center of the table. "He's going to tell a story, isn't he?" Megan asked, looking at her guest. Emily raised an eyebrow, but the corner of her mouth betrayed a smile. "Maybe, if everyone eats without complaining," Luke replied, playing along. Dinner flowed with a lightness Emily hadn't remembered feeling in years. Luke told stories about the horses of Hollow Creek, the colt who would only take water from the blue bucket, the chestnut who feigned a limp for apples. Megan laughed with her mouth full, and even Clara, always more reserved, let out quiet chuckles. Emily allowed herself to listen without thinking about what would come next, simply enjoying the moment, the sound of voices, and the feeling that the house breathed differently that night. After the meal, Emily cleared the plates, but Luke insisted on helping. "No, go outside with them," she said, drying her hands on her apron. "They want to see the falls, and I think you're the right teacher for that." He didn't argue. In the corral, under the yellow light that hung from the barn, he handed each girl a handful of grain. "Keep your hand open, or you'll accidentally get pinched." Megan approached boldly, laughing when a foal's warm nose brushed against hers. Clara, more cautious, watched before trying, but when the animal began to eat, a genuine smile broke across her face. Luke spoke softly, patiently, as if each gesture were an important lesson. He showed them how to stroke a horse's mane without startling it, and how to recognize when a horse was relaxed. The girls absorbed every word, and the night seemed to open up around them, with the soft sounds of the animals chewing and the distant rustling of the trees. From the kitchen window, Emily watched the scene. The glass was fogged by the contrast between the heat inside and the cold outside, but she clearly saw the way Luke crouched down to speak at the girls' level, the care with which he guided their hands, the calm he exuded. Her chest tightened not with pain, but with something that mixed gratitude, surprise, and a quiet fear of allowing herself to feel again. When they returned inside, the air was filled with laughter and the smell of hay. Megan rushed to tell her how her colt, Flash, had tried to eat Luke's hat, and Clara, with a new sparkle in her eyes, said she wanted to learn to care for horses like him. Emily served hot tea for everyone, and for a moment she realized that this kitchen, once marked by silence and haste, now had something that felt like home. Luke said goodbye later, putting on his coat and adjusting his hat. Emily walked him to the door, and as he descended the steps, she realized a part of her wanted him to come back the next day, and the next, and the next. "Thanks for dinner," he said. She nodded, keeping her eyes on him as she walked to the truck. The girls went upstairs, still laughing, and Emily stood for a moment on the porch, watching the taillights of the F-150 disappear down the road. The night chill didn't bother her. There was something warm about her, something that didn't come from the stove or the fireplace. Maybe it was the sound of voices filling the empty spaces of the house. Maybe it was the way Luke looked at them, at all of them, as if they were part of something he wanted to keep. As she entered and closed the door, Emily leaned her back against the wood and took a deep breath. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence that held promise. And she knew that somehow she was getting closer to wanting to hear what he had to say. The day dawned with a heavy sky, tinged with a deep gray that foretold a storm. The wind carried the damp scent of approaching rain, and the distant sound of thunder echoed across the hills. Luke parked the F-150 in the ranch yard, carrying a ladder, nails, and some new shingles in the back. Emily was already outside, looking at the roof with concern. "If the wind picks up, these shingles will fly off," she said, holding her hair up in her hands. Luke gave a half smile, grabbing his tools. "Then let's get this done before the sky breaks." As he climbed the ladder, Emily held one of the bases steady, passing the shingles to it and holding the bag of nails. With each stronger gust, Luke adjusted his balance, feeling the cold seep through his shirt, but focused on the work. The dry sound of the hammer mingled with the whistling of the wind, and Emily, even from below, sensed that each tap was more than just a repair. It was a way for him to cement his presence there. When the last nail was driven, Luke descended, slowly, his boots squeaking against the metal steps. He set down the hammer and took a deep breath, staring at Emily as if to preserve that image of her against the dark sky. A stray strand of hair escaped her bun and fell across her face, blown by the wind. Without thinking, he reached up and brushed the lock behind her ear. The gesture was brief but intense, and her eyes held his for longer than she would have liked to admit. Emily dropped her gaze, taking a step back. I'm not used to this," she murmured. Luke frowned. "To what?" She took a deep breath, as if opening a wound. "To someone caring, to someone being here, and I'm starting to get used to it. It's scary. Scared of depending on someone again." Her voice was firm, but there was a hidden, almost imperceptible tremor. He was silent for a few seconds, the sound of the wind filling the space between them. Then he took a step forward, his voice low and sure. "I don't want you to depend on me, Emily." She looked up, surprised by his answer. "I want you to trust me." The words came out slowly, like a nail driven firmly into wood. Her eyes flashed with something that wasn't just emotion. It was an internal conflict between the urge to retreat and the desire to stay. The rain began to fall in thick drops, slapping against the newly repaired roof. "The storm's coming," she said, almost as a warning to both of them. Luke simply nodded, but didn't take his eyes off her. They ran inside as the rain thickened, pounding against the wooden walls. The kitchen was darker than usual, lit only by the dim light from the window and the roar of the fire in the fireplace. Emily took off her coat, her shoulders still tense, and Luke set his tools by the door. For a moment, they stood there, each in a corner, listening to the roar of the storm. It was Emily who broke the silence. "I don't know if I know how to trust like this again." Luke approached, stopping a step away. "Trust doesn't come ready-made. We build it, one day at a time." Their breath mingled for a moment, and Emily felt his warmth, even without his touch. The sound of thunder nearby rattled the windows, but inside the kitchen, there was an eerie calm. Luke gave a half-smile, almost imperceptible, before saying, "I'll be back tomorrow." Emily nodded, and this time, it wasn't an automatic gesture. It was permission. When he left later, the rain had eased, but the smell of wet earth lingered across the yard. Emily stood on the porch, watching him get into his truck. She could still feel his brief touch on her skin, as if the wind hadn't blown it away. And as he drove away, she realized that, for the first time in years, the fear of depending on someone was sharing space with something new. the desire to believe. The next morning brought a timid sunshine, filtered through the whitish clouds left over from the previous night's storm. Luke parked the F-150 near the barn, the bed loaded with new boards, bags of nails, and tools. Emily, already in boots and with her shirt sleeves rolled up, came out to meet him. "What's all this?" she asked, smoothing her tied-up hair. Luke smirked. "A project. I thought about building an addition to the barn. It'll make it easier to care for the horses, and maybe have other uses." She raised an eyebrow suspiciously, but couldn't hide the slight smile that escaped. Emily's daughters came running up, curious about the commotion. Sarah, the oldest, held a hammer almost bigger than her. "Can I help?" she asked enthusiastically. Luke crouched down, looking her in the eye. "Sure, but only when I tell you to. Safety first, young lady." Emily watched the scene, trying to hide how much it affected her. Over the past few months, his presence had become part of their routine, and it frightened her as much as it comforted her. They began measuring the space, the sound of the measuring tape stretching mingling with the distant birdsong. Luke cut the boards with precision, while Emily held the ends, his strength contrasting with her delicacy. Every now and then, their fingers would brush briefly, and each contact seemed to carry a meaning neither of them dared to verbalize. The daughters helped by carrying smaller pieces of wood and cans of nails. Their laughter filled the courtyard, mingled with the rhythmic sound of Luke's hammer. Emily found herself laughing too, a spontaneous laugh, so different from the heavy silence that usually reigned there. The sun was shining brighter now, illuminating the teamwork taking shape. Before her eyes dot as they installed the walls of the addition, Luke and Emily exchanged a look that spoke volumes. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a bridge, a silent connection that grew with each plank placed in place. Deep down, Emily knew this space wouldn't just change the barn. It would change her and the girls' lives. By late afternoon, the annex had taken shape. Luke wiped his hands on his jeans, looking at the newly erected structure with satisfaction. "It'll be useful and beautiful," he said, casting a quick glance at Emily. She moved closer, examining the pale wood walls. "This place will never be the same," she said, almost in a whisper. Luke smiled, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Their daughters ran over, proud of their work. Sarah held up a crooked nail she'd hammered in herself. "It wasn't perfect, but I tried." Luke patted her shoulder lightly. "Perfect is when we do it together." Emily felt her heart sink at that statement, realizing he wasn't just talking about the nail. He was talking about everything. Night fell, and the scent of new wood mingled with the cold earth. Before leaving, Luke gathered his tools and loaded them into the truck. Emily stood on the porch, watching him once more. There was no rush in. His departure, as if to make it clear he would return. And deep down, she already knew she wanted him back. As the F-150's engine faded into the road, Emily stared at the barn, illuminated by the yellowish light leaking through the cracks. She felt something different in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the beginning of a feeling that, until recently, she'd thought was dead. Inside the house, as she put her daughters to bed, Emily heard Sarah murmur, "Mommy, ... He likes you." Emily smiled, kissing the girl's forehead. "Go to sleep, young lady." But alone in her room, she couldn't help but think that maybe Sarah was right. Spring arrived quietly, melting the snow that for months had made Hollow Creek a quiet, secluded place. The sound of horses' hooves echoed again across the open field, and the scent of early flowers mingled with the damp air. Luke pulled the truck up to the fence, a sack of feed slung over his shoulder. Emily was in the garden, planting the seeds he'd given her weeks before. When she saw him, she paused for a moment, wiping her hands on the hem of her simple blue dress, and felt her heart race without quite understanding why. He walked toward her, the setting sun tinging his face with golden hues. "Winter's over," Luke said, looking at the newly planted flowers. Emily nodded, but there was something different in her gaze, a mix of serenity and anticipation. Her daughters played in the distance, trying to catch the butterflies emerging from the field. It was as if the world, after months of silent struggle, was opening up again to warmth and life. Luke stopped beside her, leaning lightly against the wooden fence. "Emily," he began, but hesitated. The soft wind carried the scent of flowers and the distant sound of the stream. "I think you already know. I don't come here just for the horses." She felt her face heat, and she looked away to the horizon, trying to find the courage to respond. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried a weight that begged to be broken. He moved closer, so close that Emily could feel the heat of his body and hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. Luke lifted his hand, hesitant for a second, and then gently brushed away a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. His touch was slow, almost reverent. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as if that simple gesture could dissolve all. The ice still lingering inside her. "I don't want to just be someone who helps. I want to be someone who stays," Luke said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emily opened her eyes, and the way he stared at her made the world around her disappear. There was no more winter, no more painful past, just this moment. His daughters, in the distance, watched curiously but silently, as if sensing something important was about to happen. The kiss came slowly, as if both were afraid of breaking something too fragile to be rushed. First a gentle touch, a brush of lips that carried all the unspoken words of the past few months. Then deeper, more certain, as if confirming there was no turning back. Emily felt her heart pound, her entire body reacting to a warmth that didn't just come from Spring Dot. As they pulled away, Luke kept his forehead pressed against hers, smiling almost shyly. "I think that answers some questions," he said. Emily laughed softly, tears welling in her eyes. "It answers, and creates others." They held each other's gaze for a few more seconds, a kind of gaze that promises so much more than words could ever say. Their daughters ran to them, laughing, and Luke lifted Sarah into his arms, spinning her in the air as Emily watched, her chest filling with something she could finally call hope. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe there was room for a new beginning. Dot, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, Luke took her hand, lacing their fingers tightly together. "Promise you'll let me stay?" he asked. Emily didn't answer immediately, just squeezed his hand back, the simple gesture carrying the answer he needed. There, under the orange and pink sky, the ice that had separated them finally melted completely. Winter was over, and not just outside. Years had passed since that first kiss in the field, and Hollow Creek was no longer the same icy, silent place Luke had found that winter morning. The ranch flourished, not just in beauty, but in life. Emily's daughters, now grown, helped care for the colts, guiding tourists who came to see the place. The barn, once old and worn, now gleamed with new boards, and the garden she'd started planting that spring was a colorful sea of flowers. Luke, with his worn hat and steady hands, still began his day feeding the horses, but now he did so with the sound of family echoing through the porch. On the main porch, Emily gazed at the horizon with a serene smile. The lines on her face weren't from fatigue, but from lived experiences, and her gaze held the same firmness that had enchanted Luke years before. Beside her, he adjusted the rocking chair and handed her a mug of hot coffee. The scent mingled with the aroma of bread baking in the oven, while an old radio played a soft song from the 80s, bringing back memories of the time when it all began. Daughters approached, laughing, carrying bales of hay to feed the horses. Luke insisted on helping, even though they insisted they could do it alone. "I know you can, but I like being together," he said, winking at Emily, who laughed and shook her head. The complicity between them was evident even to those passing by on the dirt road, and seeing the close-knit family from a far dot in the late afternoon, the ranch was filled with golden light. Luke and Emily walked side by side through the field, watching the cattle graze and the wind sway the fences. "Remember that night in the snow?" Luke asked quietly. Emily paused for a moment, letting her gaze travel the horizon. "I remember every detail, and I remember thinking I was alone forever. Until you came along." Luke smiled, stepping closer to take her hand. "I stayed ... and I will stay until the end." The sentence was spoken unhurriedly, with the weight and strength of a promise that needed no further explanation. Emily felt her eyes well up, and the silence between them was filled only by the sound of the wind and the horses in the distance. When they returned home, they found their daughters on the porch, setting the table for dinner. The smell of roasting meat wafted through the air, and the entire house seemed to pulse with warmth and life. As they sat down to eat, laughter mingled with stories and memories, creating a perfect portrait of what they had built together. After dinner, Luke left to close the barn. Emily followed, hugging him from behind along the way. "You know, I think this ranch has always been waiting for you," she said, resting her head against his back. Luke chuckled softly and, turning to face her, cupped her face with his calloused hands. "Maybe it's always been waiting for us." The kiss came again, firm and sure, but carrying the same intensity as that first one in spring. The moon, high in the sky, illuminated the countryside, and the stars seemed to shine just for them. Emily felt that, despite all the winters to come, the warmth they had built would never be extinguished. Back on the porch, they sat side by side, listening to the distant sound of the creek. Luke put his arm around her shoulders, and Emily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling exactly where she should always be. There, under that clear, infinite sky, there was no longer room for loneliness. There was only the certainty that, against all odds, they had found each other, and that the roots they had planted in that soil would continue to grow firm and deep until the end of their days. Asterisk, as the camera slowly pulls back, revealing the ranch illuminated by the soft moonlight. The narrator's voice captivates the viewer. Some stories don't begin with grand gestures, but with a simple act of kindness in the cold of a lonely winter. And sometimes it's that one gesture that changes everything. Luke and Emily prove that love can blossom even in the coldest of terrains, and that when two souls choose to stay, nothing can tear them apart. The final scene freezes on the moment they embrace on the porch, the wind gently blowing their hair. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now to the channel and activate the bell. Here you'll always receive moving, inspiring, and unforgettable stories capable of warming even the coldest days. And tell me in the comments ... which part of this story touched you the most. I'd love to read your answer.